The graveyard shift. St. Christopher's Cemetery was no ordinary graveyard. Something about the place made people uneasy, even in daylight. The air was dense with the scent of damp soil, moss-covered stones, and something metallic, like blood, but older, rusted with time. The cemetery stretched over hills with newer graves at the front and the oldest, most forgotten ones pushed back to the far corners. For Evan, the graveyard shift at St. Christopher's was just a job. Every night he patrolled the grounds, keeping an eye out for vandals or trespassers, and making sure everything was in order. He'd grown accustomed to the occasional flicker of shadows and the whispering of the wind through the trees. But there was one part of the cemetery he tried to avoid as much as he could: the Forgotten Row. The Forgotten Row was the oldest section, its graves dating back to the 1800s. The names on the headstones were faded and worn, some crumbling beyond recognition. Weeds and tangled roots covered the area, giving it a feeling of abandonment, of souls left unrested. Local legend claimed that the Forgotten Row was haunted, that spirits there were angry, vengeful, waiting for anyone who dared disturb them. A disturbing task. One chilly October night, just as Halloween approached, Evan received an unexpected call from his supervisor. "Got a report of strange lights near the Forgotten Row," his boss said. "Could be kids playing pranks. Check it out." Evan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The idea of wandering into the Forgotten Row in the middle of the night was unsettling, but he couldn't very well refuse. He grabbed his flashlight, took a deep breath, and headed toward the oldest part of the cemetery. The air grew colder as he approached, and the wind seemed to carry strange sounds, whispers he could almost but not quite understand. When he reached the mausoleum at the center of the Forgotten Row, the flickering lights had vanished, leaving only darkness and silence. Evan shined his flashlight around, revealing crooked headstones and cracked mausoleums. Just as he turned to leave, he noticed something strange in the dirt near a gravestone, a set of small footprints. They were too small to belong to an adult, and they looked fresh, though no one else was supposed to be in the cemetery at this hour. Evan felt his skin prickle. He turned his flashlight off, straining his ears, and that's when he heard it, a faint giggle, the soft, high-pitched laugh of a child. Every instinct screamed for him to leave, but his curiosity won out. "Hello? Is someone there?" he called, his voice shaky. A shadow flickered behind a gravestone, and for just a moment he saw her. She couldn't have been older than 8, her pale face peeking out from behind the stone. She wore an old-fashioned dress, caked with dirt, and her eyes, they looked hollow, empty. Evan took a step forward, but before he could get any closer, she was gone, leaving only the echo of her laugh lingering in the air. The apparition returns. In the days that followed, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he patrolled near the Forgotten Row, he saw glimpses of the girl, standing just out of reach, her vacant eyes fixed on him. He tried to tell himself she was just a trick of his imagination, but each time he saw her, she became more vivid, more real. One night she appeared again, standing by the old mausoleum. She held something in her hands, a small, worn-out doll with missing eyes and matted hair. As Evan approached, he saw her lips moving, whispering something he couldn't hear. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she turned and began to walk deeper into the Forgotten Row. Her feet made no sound as she moved, and her dress seemed to blend into the shadows. Without thinking, Evan followed her, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he trailed behind. She led him to a grave he hadn't noticed before, one that looked far older than the others. The name on the headstone was barely legible, but he could make out the words Emily Blythe, 1894 to 1902. Evan's pulse quickened as he realized he was looking at the grave of a child who had died over a century ago. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the cemetery, and Evan felt a cold hand brush against his neck. He spun around, his flashlight shaking, but there was no one there. When he turned back to the grave, the girl was gone. The warning. The next day, Evan decided to look into the cemetery's records. He needed to understand who this girl was and why she seemed to haunt the Forgotten Row. After hours of digging, he found an old newspaper clipping from 1902. Tragic death of Emily Blythe, young girl found dead in St. Christopher's Cemetery. The article mentioned that Emily had disappeared one stormy night. Her body was found days later, near the same grave where she now seemed to appear. The circumstances of her death were vague, but townsfolk had long whispered that Emily's spirit lingered, trapped and restless, waiting for someone to help her or perhaps to take revenge. That evening, as Evan prepared for his shift, an old man approached him in the cemetery office. It was George, a retired caretaker who had worked at St. Christopher's for over 40 years. "You've seen her, haven't you?" George asked, his voice heavy with a mix of sympathy and fear. Evan didn't need to ask who he meant. "Yes, Emily." George sighed, shaking his head. "I saw her too back when I first started here. She appears to some, but not to everyone. She's looking for something, or someone. Be careful, lad. Don't let her lead you too deep into the forgotten row. Many who've followed her haven't come back." Evan nodded, feeling a sense of dread settle over him. George's warning echoed in his mind all night as he patrolled the cemetery. But the pull of the mystery was too strong, and despite his fear, he couldn't resist returning to the forgotten row. The descent. It was the night before Halloween, and the cemetery was shrouded in fog. As Evan approached the forgotten row, he saw her again, standing by her own grave. This time she was smiling, a strange, eerie smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "Emily," he called out. She raised a hand, beckoning him forward. Her eyes were no longer hollow, they were filled with something dark, something angry. Evan took a step forward, then another, drawn to her despite the terror that gripped him. She turned and began walking, leading him deeper into the cemetery. The fog thickened, and the air grew colder with each step, until he could see his breath hanging in the air. Suddenly he felt something hard and cold under his feet. He looked down to see a small, open grave. Before he could react, he felt a pair of tiny, ice-cold hands grab his ankles, yanking him down with unnatural strength. He screamed, struggling to free himself, but the hands only tightened, pulling him closer to the edge of the grave. He looked up to see Emily standing over him, her face twisted in anger. Her hollow eyes seemed to burn with a dark light as she whispered, "You promised you'd stay with me." Evan clawed at the ground, but more hands emerged from the earth, pale and skeletal, pulling him down into the grave. The last thing he saw was Emily's face, her smile widening into a grin, her eyes empty and endless. The awakening. Evan awoke in total darkness, the weight of the earth pressing down on him. He tried to move, to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. Panic set in as he realized he was lying in a small confined space, inside a coffin. He pounded against the lid, his fists bruising against the wood, but it didn't budge. Just as he was about to give up, he heard something, a voice, faint and distant, whispering his name, "Evan." The voice grew louder, echoing in his ears until it filled the space around him. He recognized it as George's voice, calling him back, urging him to wake up. With one last burst of strength, Evan pushed against the coffin lid, and suddenly he was free. He gasped for air as he sat up, finding himself back in the cemetery, lying on the cold, damp ground. George was there, his face pale and drawn. "You're lucky I found you," George said, helping him to his feet. "Emily nearly claimed you." Evan looked around, disoriented but grateful to be alive. He glanced back at Emily's grave, half expecting to see her there, but the grave was empty, the ground undisturbed. George shook his head solemnly. "She'll keep waiting, always looking for someone to take her place, but remember, lad, no one rests easy in the forgotten row." Evan never returned to the graveyard shift after that night, but he could still feel Emily's presence, lurking in the shadows of his memories, waiting for the next caretaker, brave or foolish enough to follow her into the forgotten row.